Somewhere in the mountains of North Korea, in the last week of November 1950, a Marine sits alone on night watch and takes off his boot. His foot is numb, and he can't remember exactly when the feeling left it. He doesn't know it yet, but the boot he's holding was never designed for this. Not this cold, not this altitude, not this war. 2 days from now, more than 100,000 Chinese soldiers are going to come down out of those same mountains in the dark, and the cold sitting in his foot right now is going to end up costing more American lives than the enemy will. That's not an exaggeration. That's a documented fact. In the battle that's about to unfold at a place called the Chosin Reservoir, cold weather casualties will actually outnumber combat casualties in some of the units fighting there. Men are going to lose fingers, toes and feet to frostbite before they even fire a shot. And the strange part is, almost none of the equipment meant to stop that from happening is going to work the way the Army and Marine Corps planned it to. So this Marine, and thousands of men just like him, are going to solve the problem themselves. With rotated socks kept warm against their own skin. With rifle oil rationed and thinned because the standard issue kind froze solid in the cold. With frostbitten limbs wrapped in whatever spare cloth or clothing a man could find, and with medics warming morphine in their own mouths because there was no other way to get it into a wounded soldier's veins in time. None of it came from a supply officer or a training manual. All of it kept men alive through what still stands as one of the coldest, most brutal fights in American military history. This is the story of how they survived a war and a winter at the same time, and how, again and again, the fix came from the men themselves, passed hand to hand and foxhole to foxhole faster than any change to official doctrine ever could have moved. North Korea, October 1950. 2 months earlier, the war looked, to almost everyone involved, like it was already won. In September, United Nations forces under General Douglas MacArthur had pulled off one of the boldest maneuvers of the entire war, an amphibious landing at Incheon that caught the North Korean army completely off guard and reversed what had, only weeks earlier, looked like a losing campaign for the South. The landing itself had been considered so risky by many of MacArthur's own staff that some had argued against attempting it at all, given the extreme tidal ranges at Incheon and the narrow window of hours each day when landing craft could actually approach the shore without running aground. MacArthur pushed the operation through anyway, and it worked spectacularly, catching North Korean forces so far out of position that Seoul was retaken within days, and the North Korean People's Army was thrown into full retreat, falling back so quickly that entire regiments simply dissolved rather than continuing to fight. And MacArthur, riding the momentum of that single audacious victory, made a decision that would define everything that happened next. He pushed north, past the 38th parallel that had divided North and South Korea since the end of the Second World War, driving toward the Yalu River and the border with China itself. MacArthur was confident, not cautiously optimistic, confident in the way that only a commander riding an unbroken string of victories can be. He told his commanders the war would be over by Christmas. Speaking to Major General John B. Coulter that November, he put it even more plainly than that, telling him to pass the word down to the men that once they reached the Yalu they were going home, and that he intended to make good on his promise that they would eat Christmas dinner in their own houses, with their own families, the whole war wrapped up before the year was out. It's the kind of promise that sounds good in a headline and terrible in hindsight, and by the time this story's over, you'll understand exactly why. A month earlier, in October, President Truman had flown out to Wake Island in the Pacific specifically to meet with MacArthur in person and press him directly on this exact question. Truman wanted to know how likely Chinese or Soviet intervention actually was, given how close American forces were now operating to China's own border. MacArthur told him it was unlikely, and added that if Chinese forces did intervene in any meaningful way, American air power would, in his words, slaughter them before they ever got close to Seoul. Truman, for his part, presented MacArthur with his 5th Distinguished Service Medal during that same meeting, a gesture of confidence in the general that would look considerably less warranted only a few weeks later. Here's what MacArthur didn't fully believe, even as evidence of it piled up in front of him. China had been watching the American advance toward its own border with real, growing alarm for weeks. Chinese leadership had feared exactly this kind of push toward the Yalu since the moment American forces landed at Incheon in September, correctly reading the landing as the beginning of a campaign that could eventually reach their own border, rather than stopping at the original goal of simply restoring South Korea. Mao Zedong and the Chinese leadership debated the decision at length internally before committing to it, weighing the risks of open war with the United States against the danger of an American or Allied army sitting directly on China's own frontier. By mid-October, that internal debate had resolved, and Mao ordered the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, under the command of General Peng Dehuai, to move against the advancing American and United Nations forces. They weren't going to allow American and United Nations troops to reach the Yalu unchallenged, and they began quietly moving forces across the border into North Korea as early as mid-October, weeks before most American commanders believed China was seriously involved at all. These were not small symbolic units. Entire Chinese armies, more than 100,000 men initially, and growing toward 12 full divisions and beyond as November wore on, crossed the Yalu at night, on foot, avoiding roads and daylight movement almost entirely, staying so completely hidden from American reconnaissance that for weeks, US commanders had no accurate sense of how many of them were actually in the country. There were warning signs. In early November, American troops captured prisoners identified as members of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army during small skirmishes near the advancing front. Some of these prisoners talked. Intelligence reports made their way up the chain of command describing organized Chinese units, not stragglers, not volunteers, actual formed divisions, operating inside North Korea. At the top of that chain, the assumption held anyway, that this was some kind of limited, face-saving gesture from Beijing rather than a full-scale intervention. MacArthur, and the officers around him who shared his confidence, chose to keep pushing north. As part of that final push toward the Yalu, the 1st Marine Division, under Major General Oliver P. Smith, received orders to advance inland from the North Korean coast, moving northwest along a single, narrow, unpaved supply road that climbed through the Taebaek Mountains toward a long man-made lake called the Chosin Reservoir. From there, the plan called for the Marines to turn west and link up with the American 8th Army, which was advancing along a separate route further to the west, closing what commanders in Tokyo hoped would be the final pincer movement of the entire war. It's worth sitting with the geography here, because it matters enormously for everything that comes after. The road to the reservoir ran roughly 55 miles through some of the most punishing terrain in Korea, steep mountain passes, narrow gorges, stretches reduced in places to a single lane of gravel, wide enough for barely one vehicle to pass at a time. And it was already turning cold in these mountains, not the ordinary chill of a Korean autumn, but the beginning of a mountain winter that was only going to get worse as the advance continued. Major General Smith was uneasy about the whole operation almost from the moment he received his orders. Looking at the single fragile road his entire division would depend on for 55 miles of mountain terrain, he remarked to his own staff, with characteristic understatement, that there was simply no easy way to get to the Chosin Reservoir. He had been cautious at every stage of the advance north, making sure ammunition and supplies were stockpiled at each position before pushing further and arguing repeatedly for improvements to the single supply road his division now depended on entirely, going so far as to order the construction of supply dumps and rough airstrips at both Hagururi and Kotori, specifically because he distrusted how thin and exposed his division's position along that road actually was. His superior, Major General Edward Almond, commanding X-Corps and reporting directly to MacArthur, did not share that caution. Almond had built his career on fast, aggressive operations, the kind of relentless tempo MacArthur himself favoured and rewarded, and the growing friction between these two men, one advancing carefully, stockpiling and questioning, the other pushing forward on an accelerated schedule, is going to matter enormously in the days ahead. The two men could hardly have been more different, and the friction between them ran deeper than simple disagreement over tactics. Smith, nicknamed the Professor by the men serving under him, had grown up poor in Northern California after his father died when he was 7, arriving at the University of California, Berkeley, with almost nothing to his name and working his way through school doing gardening jobs on the side. He was soft-spoken, methodical, and known for choosing careful planning over rash action whenever the choice was his to make. Almond, by contrast, had built a reputation on speed and aggression, and the two men had disliked each other from their very first meeting in Japan, before the Incheon landing, when Almond had lectured Smith about how straightforward amphibious landings supposedly were, despite having never planned or taken part in one himself, and addressed the older Marine general as son, though the two men were, in fact, born less than a year apart. Smith later put the core of their disagreement plainly to those close to him. Almond, he said, was a MacArthur man through and through, and whatever MacArthur said, nothing could change Almond's mind about it. As far as Almond was concerned, Smith observed, MacArthur was God. Chinese commanders on the other side of that same relationship were, unlike Almond, watching Smith's caution very closely and reading it correctly. General Peng Dehuai, the top Chinese commander overseeing the entire intervention in Korea, had told his own subordinates weeks before the battle that their strategy would be to lure American forces deep into a trap and destroy them piece by piece, rather than confronting them head-on immediately, and Smith's own deliberate pace, slowing his advance specifically to consolidate supplies and build airstrips rather than racing north the way Almond wanted, ended up working directly against that same Chinese plan, buying time and infrastructure that would prove decisive once the trap actually sprang. Most people never hear about this part of the story, the quiet disagreement in a command tent weeks before a single shot was fired at Chosin, but it's the reason thousands of Marines ended up strung out along a single mountain road, in freezing weather, with a massive hidden enemy force closing in from multiple directions at once, largely undetected until it was already too late to reposition. Smith's unease went further than private conversations with his own staff. In a letter written directly to the Commandant of the Marine Corps before the Chinese attack began, he put his misgivings on record in language that reads, in hindsight, almost like a warning nobody above him wanted to hear. Our left flank is wide open, he wrote, adding that he had little confidence in the tactical judgment of X-Corps, or in the realism of its planning. Those misgivings were noted and then set aside. MacArthur's promise to have the boys home for Christmas carried its own momentum by that point, reinforced only weeks earlier when the general met President Truman in person on Wake Island in mid-October and assured him directly that he did not expect China to intervene in the war at all. Within a day of that meeting, American reconnaissance had already spotted a regiment of Chinese troops crossing the Yalu River. MacArthur pressed forward regardless. There were other signs too, the kind that only read as ominous after the fact. In the days before the Chinese attack, Marine units around the reservoir began noticing unusually large numbers of deer moving down out of the surrounding ridgelines, driven from their normal ground by something the animals could sense, long before any American patrol could confirm it. Nobody connected that detail to an approaching army at the time. It would only make sense in hindsight once the mountains those deer had been fleeing turned out to be full of Chinese soldiers already dug in and waiting. By mid-November, elements of the 1st Marine Division had reached positions around the reservoir itself, at places whose names would soon become permanently etched into Marine Corps history. Udamni, on the western side of the lake. Hagaruri, at its southern tip, serving as the division's forward logistics base. Kotori, further south along the same single road. The temperature at night was already dropping into genuinely dangerous territory, and on November 14th, a cold front swept down out of Siberia and settled directly over the mountains, sending temperatures plunging to as low as 36 degrees below zero at some positions, with certain forward outposts recording individual readings even lower than that. Let that number sit for a moment. 36 degrees below zero is not a temperature most people will ever personally experience in their lives, and it was not a temperature the standard issue gear these men carried had been designed to withstand. Vehicle engines had to be kept running around the clock, because if a truck or tank engine shut down in cold like this, there was a very real chance it simply would not restart. Rifles and machine guns began seizing up in the field. Hot meals froze into blocks of ice in the time it took a man to walk from the serving line to a place where he could sit down and eat. And this was before the fighting had even started. For a few days, in the cold and the quiet of those high mountains, it actually felt almost calm. Patrols went out and returned without serious contact. Supply convoys made their way up and down the narrow road without major incident. Thanksgiving came and went, and at Major General Almond's headquarters, on Thanksgiving Day itself, Almond sat down with Smith over dinner and laid out his plans for the coming week, describing his intention to push the Marine advance further west, completing MacArthur's promised victory before Christmas arrived. That calm did not last. 12 Chinese divisions, more than 120,000 men in total, were already in position around the reservoir by then, hidden in the mountains on both sides of the American advance, waiting for a single coordinated order. On the night of November 27, 1950, that order came. At Udamni, on the western side of the reservoir, the 5th and 7th Marine Regiments had spent that day settling into position, preparing for the next morning's push further west as part of Almond's plan. Around them, in the hills and ridgelines overlooking the village, Chinese soldiers of the 9th Army Group had already been dug in for hours, waiting under cover of darkness and heavy snowfall. The Marines at Udamni had no accurate way of knowing how many of them there actually were. Just after midnight, the Chinese attacked. They came the way Chinese forces had already learned to fight American units earlier in the war, at night, in overwhelming numbers, using bugles and whistles to coordinate movement between units and to disorient the men on the receiving end of the assault. Marine accounts from that first night describe waves of soldiers materializing out of the snow and darkness almost without warning, striking positions from multiple directions simultaneously. One Marine private, recalling the noise of that first assault years later, described hearing a racket coming up the slope toward his position that sounded, in his words, like a Chinese birthday party, wedding and funeral all rolled into one, the bugles and whistles and shouting blending into something almost impossible to describe to anyone who hadn't heard it firsthand. In one sector of the perimeter defending Udamni that first night, Chinese soldiers pressed close enough to begin throwing grenades directly into American positions. When one landed near a machine gun position manned by Staff Sergeant Robert Kennemore, with several of his fellow Marines close by and no time to throw it clear, Kennemore stomped his own boot down on the grenade to drive it into the snow, absorbing the blast himself rather than letting it detonate among the men around him. He survived, though severely wounded, and the act would later earn him the Medal of Honor. It was one of several such moments that first night. Close, desperate, hand-to-hand fighting in temperatures cold enough to freeze a man's canteen solid, where the distance between living and dying came down to a single decision made in less than a second. By morning, the Marine perimeter around Udamni was still holding, though only barely, and Chinese forces had already begun cutting the single road connecting Udamni to the rest of the division further south. One American veteran of the fighting further along that same defensive line, recalling the attacks decades later in an interview, described a memory that had stayed with him his entire life. Waves of Chinese infantry advancing across open, snow-covered ground toward his position, absorbing round after round of American fire without slowing down, men falling only to be replaced instantly by others pressing forward from behind them. He remembered his own machine gun barrel glowing red from sustained firing, and still the advancing shapes kept coming, indistinguishable from one another in the dark and the snow, more like moving logs than men, in his own words, until the sheer volume of fire finally broke the assault. He lost 7 of his own toes to frostbite that same freezing night, and of his company, only he and a handful of others survived the fighting intact enough to keep moving. Decades afterward, he said he still couldn't fully explain, even to himself, how soldiers from a country as poor and technologically outmatched as China had thrown themselves forward the way they did, wave after wave, seemingly without fear of what was clearly, by any rational calculation, a losing exchange of casualties for ground gained. The real question that mattered now wasn't whether the Marines could hold Udamni for one more night. It was whether the rest of the division, spread out along 55 miles of a single mountain road, could survive what was clearly a coordinated attack against every position at once. The answer, over the following days, would depend heavily on a group of soldiers who weren't Marines at all, and whose story, even today, far fewer people know, as well as they know the story of the 1st Marine Division. East of the reservoir, a smaller, hastily assembled army unit had been sent forward to relieve Marine positions and screen the division's eastern flank. It was built around the 31st Infantry Regiment and originally commanded by Colonel Alan D. McLean, a 1930 graduate of West Point with combat experience going back to the Second World War, where he had served as a staff officer in the European theatre, before later commanding the 32nd Infantry in Japan. The unit would come to be known, informally, by 2 names in succession over the following days, first Task Force McLean, and then, after McLean's death, Task Force Faith, named for the officer who took over command in the middle of the fighting, Lieutenant Colonel Don Faith. Task Force McLean had been thrown together quickly, without the kind of careful coordination and stockpiling that Major General Smith had insisted on for his own Marine units further west. The task force held a stretch of ground east of the reservoir organised around 3 separate positions. Faith's own 1st Battalion, 32nd Infantry, holding forward, A second grouping built around the 3rd Battalion, 31st Infantry, along with 2 artillery batteries, dug in on poor defensive ground a couple of miles south at a place called the Pungguri Inlet, and further south still, a rear command post at a schoolhouse in the village of Hudongni, garrisoned by the task force's own small tank company, along with several hundred headquarters and supply personnel. Late on November 27th, before the main assault even began, Maclean sent a reconnaissance platoon out to scout Chinese positions in the surrounding hills. The platoon walked directly into an ambush, and every single man in it was killed or wounded before the main attack that night had even started. With the temperature nearing 30 degrees below zero on the night of November 27th, roughly 80,000 Chinese soldiers struck along a 35-mile stretch of road on both sides of the reservoir at once, hitting Task Force Maclean along with everyone else in X-Corps' overextended line. On the same night the Chinese hit Udumni, they also struck east of the reservoir, and Task Force Maclean found itself facing a similarly coordinated wave of night attacks with far less time to prepare and far less internal cohesion than the Marines had built up over the preceding weeks of careful, methodical advance. Colonel Maclean himself was captured in the chaos of the fighting in the days that followed and later died in Chinese custody, and command of what remained of the task force passed fully to Lieutenant Colonel Don Faith. By the time dawn broke on December the 1st, the scene inside what remained of Task Force Faith's perimeter had become almost impossible to describe in ordinary terms. Survivors huddled in small scattered groups around whatever fires they could keep burning near the unit's remaining artillery pieces, starving, exhausted and badly frostbitten, while the frozen bodies of American, Chinese and Korean dead lay scattered across the surrounding terrain, the aftermath of days of close, vicious fighting fought almost entirely at night. Some of the wounded, unable to move under their own power and with no way to evacuate them, had simply frozen to death where they lay. Most people who know the broad outline of the Chosin story know that the Marines fought their way out. Fewer know that a smaller, less prepared army task force east of the reservoir was, at the very same time, fighting a battle that would later be recognised as one of the things that made the entire Marine breakout possible, and that recognition took the better part of 50 years to arrive. Major General Smith had seen at least the shape of this coming, in his own way. He had argued for caution at every stage of the advance north, pushed for supply stockpiles at every position, and questioned the pace Almond wanted the whole corps to keep. Almond had not fully listened. Now, in the space of a single night, both halves of X-Corps, the Marines to the west and the Army Task Force to the east, were fighting for their lives against an enemy whose true size and intentions had been badly underestimated by nearly everyone above them in the chain of command. The disaster unfolding around the reservoir was not, as it turned out, an isolated failure of intelligence or judgment specific to X-Corps alone. On the western side of the peninsula, the American 8th Army, advancing on a separate front toward the same stretch of the Yalu River, was simultaneously being struck by a similarly massive, similarly well-hidden Chinese force along the Chongchon River, in fighting that would prove just as costly and just as disastrous for the broader offensive MacArthur had launched only days earlier. Within days, the 8th Army's own advance had collapsed into a headlong retreat southward, a mirror image of the crisis unfolding simultaneously around Chosin, and confirmation, if anyone in Tokyo still needed it, that the entire premise behind the Home by Christmas offensive, that Chinese intervention would remain limited and containable, had been catastrophically wrong from the very start. On November 28th, with the scale of the Chinese attack becoming impossible to ignore on both fronts at once, Major General Almond flew out personally to confer with his commanders in the field around Chosin. What he told them, according to multiple documented accounts from officers present that day, badly misjudged the situation his own men were actually in. Speaking to the exhausted, badly outnumbered soldiers of Task Force Maclean, Almond dismissed the scale of the threat outright, telling them not to let what he called a bunch of goddamn Chinese laundrymen stop their advance to the Yalu. He then presented several Silver Star medals on the spot to Faith, to a wounded lieutenant standing nearby, and, according to the same account, to a mess sergeant who happened to be walking past at the time. He climbed back into his helicopter and left. Faith's reaction, once Almond was gone, has been recorded by multiple historians who later interviewed men present that day. He tore the medal from his uniform, threw it into the snow, and reportedly called it a damned travesty. This is where the story takes a turn that still, decades later, sits uneasily with military historians studying the campaign, because within days, the same commander who had just praised these exhausted men for holding a position against, in his own words, laundrymen, would see his own most capable officer killed and the unit under that officer's command all but destroyed, fighting an enemy force that outnumbered them by a margin nobody at Corps headquarters had accurately understood at the time. You'd think someone flying in from the rear, looking at exhausted men who had just survived a night of coordinated attacks in 50 below zero cold, might have paused before handing out medals and lecturing them about laundrymen. Nobody did. Not that day, and not for a long time afterward. Up to this point in the story, the greatest danger facing the men trapped around the Chosin Reservoir seemed, on paper, to be the enemy surrounding them on every side. That was about to be joined by a second enemy that had been quietly working against every man on that mountain since well before the first shot was fired, and it was only just getting started. By the time the Chinese offensive struck on the night of November 27th, the temperature around the reservoir had already been sliding toward genuinely dangerous territory for nearly 2 weeks. This wasn't an unusually cold night here and there. This was the entire operating environment for the battle that followed, an environment that would eventually produce cold weather casualties climbing into the thousands, in some tallies actually outnumbering the men wounded or killed by enemy fire outright. For the soldiers of Task Force McLean, fighting east of the reservoir, the equipment situation was worse than anything the Marines further west were dealing with, and it wasn't simply a matter of design flaws in otherwise reasonable gear. In the rush to comply with MacArthur's timetable for pushing X-Corps into position, the units that would become Task Force McLean and later Task Force Faith had been given no meaningful stockpiles of ammunition, fuel or rations before moving into the mountains, and almost no effort had been made to issue proper winter clothing at all. Many of these soldiers went into the coldest fighting of the entire war, wearing ordinary field jackets with thin pile liners and lightweight cotton trousers, without the long hooded fur-lined parkas that were considered standard for this kind of climate. Their radio equipment was similarly inadequate, leaving units east of the reservoir with barely functioning communication between one position and the next at the exact moment coordination mattered most. The task force's cohesion problems ran deeper than equipment alone. Close to a quarter of the 7th Infantry Division, the parent unit behind Task Force McLean, was made up of South Korean soldiers hastily integrated directly into American units as individual replacements rather than trained and organized as a cohesive force of their own, a program adopted in the rush to bring understrength American divisions up to full manpower as the war ground on. Many of these soldiers arrived with only the most basic training, some barely able to communicate with the American troops around them, and in the chaos and confusion of the fighting that followed, more than one American officer later described these hastily integrated soldiers behaving, understandably, more like men caught up in a war they'd had little preparation for than like fully functioning combat infantry. It was one more way in which the task force sent east of the reservoir had been assembled faster and prepared far less thoroughly than the Marine regiments fighting the same battle only a few miles away. It's worth taking a moment to sit with what that kind of cold actually does to a human body, because the numbers alone don't quite capture it. At 35 degrees below zero, exposed skin can develop frostbite in a matter of minutes. Bare metal becomes dangerous to touch with an ungloved hand. Simple tasks, tying a boot, loading a rifle magazine, taking a drink of water, becomes slow and difficult, because cold this extreme doesn't simply make men uncomfortable. It makes their bodies stop functioning properly, one system at a time, starting at the extremities and working inward. Start with the boots, because the boots are where this particular story really begins. The standard cold weather boot issued to American troops in Korea was known as the shoe pack, a leather upper attached to a rubber lower section, originally designed to keep water out in wet, cold conditions. It had one serious design flaw that nobody had fully accounted for in mountain conditions this extreme. The rubber lower section didn't breathe, which meant a man's own sweat, produced simply from walking and working in the cold, had nowhere to go. It built up steadily inside the boot, and in temperatures this far below freezing, that trapped moisture froze solid around the foot, encasing it in a shell of ice formed entirely from the wearer's own body. Marine accounts from Chosin describe men whose boots had to be cut or physically pried off their feet because they had frozen fast to the skin. One badly frostbitten survivor, lying in a hospital bed afterward, told Life magazine that it took medics 30 full minutes just to get his boots off, because they were frozen stuck. This was not a rare or isolated case. Cold injuries at Chosin eventually totaled somewhere around 7,000 to 8,000 men, and by the time the campaign was fully tallied, non-battle cold weather casualties in the 1st Marine Division alone came to more than 7,300, a number that stands alongside, and by some measures actually exceeds, the division's combat casualties from the entire battle. It's worth pausing here to note that the cold was not an enemy that discriminated by uniform. The Chinese soldiers of the 9th Army Group, hastily redirected to Korea from garrison duty in a much warmer part of China, arrived in these same mountains equipped even more poorly than the Americans they were about to surround. Many wore thin cotton uniforms and simple canvas sneakers rather than proper winter boots, with nothing resembling adequate cold weather gear issued to them at all. Chinese accounts collected decades after the battle describe entire units suffering catastrophic cold weather losses of their own, sometimes losing more men to frostbite and exposure in a single week than to American firepower over the course of the entire campaign. Whole companies were later found frozen in their fighting positions, having held their assigned ground until the cold itself killed them, rather than retreat. Whatever else can be said about the two armies fighting for control of these mountains in the winter of 1950, neither side had come prepared for the kind of cold that both of them ended up fighting in equal measure. Most people picture a battle like Chosin and imagine the danger coming entirely from the enemy, dug into the hills around them. The truth is that plenty of men who survived every single Chinese assault thrown at them still came out of those mountains missing fingers, toes, or feet, because the fight against the cold never stopped, even in the quiet hours between attacks, even when no enemy was firing at all. The weapons had their own version of the same problem. Standard rifle and machine gun lubricant designed for temperate conditions gelled and thickened in the extreme cold, slowing the action of weapons enough to cause jams and misfires at exactly the moments men needed those weapons to work without a single moment's hesitation. Some of the heavier, water-cooled machine guns, the kind that relied on a water jacket surrounding the barrel to manage heat during sustained firing, froze completely solid overnight if left unused, the water inside the jacket turning to ice and locking the entire mechanism in place. Crews manning these weapons had to thaw them out over open fires the next morning before bringing them back into action, and in at least one documented case from the defense of a position called Toktong Pass, crews began mixing automotive antifreeze directly into the water jackets themselves after that first frozen night, a fix that had nothing to do with how those weapons were designed to be maintained, and everything to do with keeping them firing through the remaining nights of a 5-day siege. Medical care faced its own version of the same problem, and this is where the cold's effect on the wounded becomes genuinely difficult to sit with. Blood plasma, essential for treating serious battlefield wounds, froze solid in its containers and became completely useless exactly when it was needed most. Morphine, packaged in small glass tubes called syrettes for battlefield use, froze as well, and medics working under fire in these conditions found a grim workaround. They warmed the syrettes in their own mouths before they could inject a wounded man, because there was often no other heat source fast enough or close enough at hand. Even removing a wounded soldier's clothing to treat an injury carried its own danger, since exposed, wet skin in cold this extreme could develop frostbite or gangrene within minutes, turning a treatable wound into a much more serious one almost instantly. The real question facing every unit strung out along that single mountain road wasn't just how to fight off wave after wave of Chinese infantry. It was how to keep men's bodies functioning well enough to fight at all, in conditions that were actively working against them every single hour of every single day, whether the Chinese attacked that particular night or not. Charlie Gebhardt, an army sergeant who fought east of the reservoir with the 31st Infantry Regiment, described the feeling decades later in an interview, saying his feet felt like they had turned to balls of lead and that his fingers had started turning black before his eyes. He said simply that people who hadn't actually been there couldn't really imagine how cold it was. Balls of lead. Not numb, not cold, lead. That's not a poetic exaggeration from a veteran trying to tell a good story for an interviewer decades later. That's a man describing as plainly and honestly as he could manage exactly what frostbite feels like while it is actively happening to your own body. None of this equipment failure was any kind of secret to the men experiencing it firsthand. Word of what worked and what didn't spread up and down that mountain road within days, soldier to soldier, unit to unit, faster than any change to standard issue equipment ever could have moved through official Army or Marine Corps channels. And some of what these men came up with on their own, simple, improvised, entirely outside any manual, would end up mattering just as much to their survival as any weapon they carried into those mountains. That improvisation starts with the same discipline drilled into cold weather troops in training long before anyone ever expects to actually need it for real. Change your socks, and change them often, no matter how much it hurts to do it in the moment. Each shoe pack issued in Korea came with 2 sets of removable insoles and as many as 6 pairs of heavy wool socks, and the doctrine behind that issue was simple enough on paper. A man was supposed to rotate pairs constantly, wearing one pair while the rest stayed tucked inside his jacket, against his own body heat, drying out and warming up before their turn came around again. In theory, this kept a soldier's feet from sitting for hours inside sweat-soaked socks, inside a boot that had already frozen solid around them. In practice, under fire, in temperatures this extreme, it was exactly as difficult as it sounds. Pulling off a boot and both socks in 50 below zero weather, even for a few brief minutes, meant exposing bare skin to conditions that could cause frostbite entirely on their own. Some units set up small warming tents wherever the terrain and the fighting allowed it, rotating small groups of men in and out every 20 minutes or so, just to give each man a safe window to make the change without risking his feet further in the process. Where no tent was available, men did it anyway, out in the open, because the alternative, sweat-soaked feet locked inside a frozen boot for days at a stretch, was unquestionably worse. Gebhardt, the army sergeant from the 31st Infantry, described one particular habit that stuck with him for the rest of his life: keeping a spare pair of dry socks tucked permanently under his armpits, using his own body heat to keep at least one warm, dry pair ready to swap in at a moment's notice. He credited that single habit, learned from other soldiers around him rather than from any training manual, with helping him survive the very worst of the cold with his feet still fully intact. This is where the story takes a turn that says something bigger about how men actually survive conditions like this. Because almost none of these fixes came from a quartermaster, a training pamphlet, or an officer's direct order. They came from soldiers noticing what worked, telling the man standing next to them, and that small piece of knowledge spreading up and down a single frozen mountain road faster than any official change to standard issue equipment ever could have moved. The machine gun crews who discovered their water-cooled guns freezing solid overnight didn't sit around waiting for new equipment to arrive from the rear. After the first night of watching a jam gun very nearly cost them a position, at least one crew defending the perimeter at Toktong Pass began mixing automotive antifreeze directly into the water jackets themselves, a fix that had nothing to do with how those weapons were designed to be maintained, and everything to do with keeping them firing through 4 more nights of Chinese assaults on that same hill. Riflemen, for their part, learned to use standard issue gun oil far more sparingly than any training back home had ever taught them, since too much oil simply gelled and slowed a weapon's action in cold this severe, while too little left the moving parts vulnerable to seizing up entirely. Some men carried a spare weapon whenever they could manage it, a quiet, practical acknowledgement that any single rifle or machine gun might simply stop functioning at exactly the wrong moment. One of the more unusual fixes to come out of the entire campaign began as a simple communications mix-up, rather than any deliberate plan. Marine units had adopted the code name Tootsie Roll for a particular type of 60mm mortar round, and during one especially desperate stretch of fighting, a request for more Tootsie Rolls went out over the radio to a rear supply point where whoever received the message had no idea it was a code word for ammunition at all. Actual Tootsie Roll, candy, boxes and boxes of it, was airdropped to the front lines instead. Rather than treating it as a wasted resupply run, Marines on the receiving end discovered the candy solved 2 entirely unrelated problems at once. Frozen solid, a Tootsie Roll could be warmed in a man's mouth or pocket and eaten for a quick, reliable source of sugar and calories at a moment when hot rations were nearly impossible to come by. And when warmed just enough to turn pliable without fully melting, the same candy could be pressed into small holes in cracked or leaking fuel lines on vehicles and equipment, sealing them well enough to keep engines running until real repairs became possible. A miscommunication over a radio code word turned into one of the more oddly beloved pieces of battlefield improvisation to come out of the entire war, remembered fondly enough by Chosin veterans that Tootsie Roll himself, as a brand, remains associated with the battle in Marine Corps circles to this day. Medics facing frozen plasma and frozen morphine syrettes had no better option available than the one they actually used. Body heat, applied directly, held in a gloved hand or against bare skin, or in the case of the morphine syrettes, warmed inside a medic's own mouth just long enough to make the drug usable again, before injecting it into a wounded man who was already shaking from cold and blood loss at the same time. It wasn't written down in any medical training pamphlet anywhere. It became, purely out of necessity, standard practice for medics working the line at Chosin. Food presented its own quiet, grinding problem, one far less dramatic than a jammed rifle, but no less exhausting to deal with meal after meal. Standard field rations designed to be eaten hot froze solid within minutes of being served in temperatures this extreme, turning into blocks that had to be thawed over a fire, chipped apart, or simply gnawed on frozen, since there was rarely time or fuel enough to properly heat every meal for every man along that entire mountain road. Some units discovered, largely by accident, that carrying ration cans inside their own clothing, tucked against body heat the same way spare socks were, kept at least some food edible without a fire, though it meant sacrificing a small amount of the very warmth a man needed to keep the rest of his body functioning. Sleeping bags, meant to offer a few hours of real rest between watches, carried their own hidden danger that cost lives directly. Zippers froze shut in the extreme cold, and more than one Marine, caught by a Chinese infiltrator while fully zipped into a bag on a night when the perimeter was breached, had no time to fight free before being killed where he lay. Word of that particular danger spread quickly enough that many men chose to sleep only partially zipped in, or not at all, trading a few additional degrees of warmth for the ability to actually reach a weapon in time if the line broke during the night. Even the ground itself had become the enemy's quiet ally in a strange, entirely practical way. The earth around the reservoir had frozen hard enough that digging a proper foxhole with a standard-issue entrenching tool was, in many positions, close to impossible without using explosive charges first to break up the frozen soil beneath the snow. In at least one documented account from later in the campaign, defenders facing exactly this problem resorted to something almost unthinkable to imagine now from a comfortable distance, stacking frozen enemy dead in place of sandbags, using whatever material the battlefield actually offered instead of what a supply chain, stretched thin across 55 miles of icy mountain road, simply could not deliver in time. Most people who've heard the broad outline of the Chosin Reservoir story picture the fighting itself first. Fewer picture the quieter, grinding hour-by-hour improvisation that kept men's bodies working well enough to keep fighting at all, using nothing but wool socks, spare weapons, shared body heat, and antifreeze meant originally for a truck radiator. And somehow, it gets worse before it gets better, because none of these fixes actually solve the underlying problem. They only bought time, day by day, foxhole by foxhole, while the actual battle for survival was still very much underway and showing no signs of easing up. Hagaru-ri sat at the southern tip of the reservoir, a small collection of huts that had become, almost by necessity, the single most important piece of ground in the entire campaign. It was the division's forward supply base, the hinge point connecting the Marines fighting at Udamni to the west, Task Force Faith fighting east of the reservoir, and the rest of the division further south along the road to the coast. If Hagaru-ri fell, there was no clear plan for how any of the units trapped further north were going to get out at all. Since arriving in the area on November 15th, well before the Chinese attack began, engineers of the 1st Engineer Battalion, under Lieutenant Colonel John Partridge, had been working on something that would end up mattering far more than almost anyone realized at the time. A rough airstrip cut and levelled directly out of the frozen ground at Hagaru-ri, originally intended only for small liaison aircraft. By the time the fighting started in earnest, the strip was, by the engineer's own estimate, only about 40% complete. By November 27th, Hagaru-ri held roughly 3,000 Americans, the vast majority of them engineers, clerks, cooks, and supply personnel rather than combat infantry, since the actual fighting regiments of the division had already moved further north toward Udamni. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Ridge, commanding the small Marine battalion responsible for the town's defence, correctly predicted, based on the fighting already reported elsewhere around the reservoir, that the Chinese would strike Hagaru-ri directly on the night of November the 28th. With so few trained infantrymen actually available to hold the perimeter, nearly everyone in the town, including Clark's and rear echelon support troops with little or no combat training, was pressed into frontline defensive positions, and by 9:30 that evening the entire garrison was on full alert. Ridge's prediction proved accurate almost to the hour. On the night of November 28th, in what survivors would later call Hagaru's Night of Fire, the Chinese 173rd and 172nd Regiments struck the town's western, southern and northern perimeter simultaneously, threatening to overrun both the medical battalion's field hospital and that same unfinished airstrip in a single coordinated assault. The understrength garrison was overwhelmed at several points along the line, and Chinese soldiers succeeded in opening multiple gaps in the perimeter, pushing into the rear areas of the town itself. What likely saved Haguru that night, according to multiple accounts of the fighting, was an unexpected breakdown in discipline among the attacking Chinese troops themselves, some of whom stopped to loot captured American food and winter clothing, rather than continuing to press their advantage while the perimeter was still broken open. That pause gave the defenders, thin and improvised as they were, just enough time to seal the gaps and hold the line until morning. If either the hospital or the airstrip had fallen that night, the entire logistics of the eventual breakout further north would have collapsed along with them. The perimeter held, but only barely, and only because a detachment of Partridge's own engineers put down their construction tools, picked up rifles, and helped fight off the attack themselves, alongside the infantry already holding the line. Reinforcements for that same embattled perimeter arrived from an unexpected direction 2 days later, in the form of a mixed relief column that has become one of the lesser-known but genuinely remarkable footnotes of the entire campaign. Lieutenant Colonel Douglas Drysdale, commanding 41 Independent Commando of the British Royal Marines, assembled a force of just over 900 men and more than 100 vehicles, combining his own British commandos with American Army and Marine units, and set out to fight his way from Kotori to Haguru along 11 miles of ice-covered road already held at multiple points by Chinese roadblocks. The column fought through a dozen separate roadblocks and thousands of Chinese soldiers to reach Haguru, arriving badly battered but largely intact, and reinforcing a perimeter that badly needed the additional strength. It marked, according to Drysdale himself, the first time British and American Marines had fought side by side since the defence of the international legations in Peking half a century earlier, an odd, almost historical footnote tucked inside a battle that was, for the men actually fighting it, simply about survival. Not every act of individual courage during this stretch of the campaign came from an infantryman or a Marine. On November 29th, near the reservoir, an Army officer named Lieutenant Colonel John U. Page, assigned to a transportation battalion and normally responsible for coordinating traffic control along the supply route rather than combat operations, chose to stay forward when an isolated signal station came under threat of being cut off entirely. Page pulled his own jeep driver clear of an ambush near a destroyed bridge, then made his way to the besieged Marine garrison at Kotori, where he volunteered to help train a scratch force of Marines and soldiers, and, working with the same urgency that was driving engineers at Haguru, helped prepare a makeshift airstrip on the frozen ground there as well, so casualties could be evacuated from Kotori, the same way they were already being flown out further north. Page was killed in later fighting during the withdrawal, and was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, one of 14 Marines, 2 Army soldiers, and 1 Navy pilot ultimately recognized with the nation's highest decoration for valor for actions during the Chosin campaign. If that sounds bad, keep listening, because the fighting at Haguru was only the beginning of what that half-finished airstrip was about to be asked to do. By early December, Haguru had a growing, urgent problem that had nothing directly to do with combat itself. Hundreds of wounded men were arriving faster than the aid stations could properly treat them, with nowhere safe to send them and no way to move them out by road, since the road itself was cut and contested by Chinese forces in multiple places at once. Major General Smith later wrote plainly that the only real solution to the growing casualty problem was completing that airstrip, whatever condition it was actually in at the time. Engineers still considered the strip only about 40% finished. Command decided to try landing a transport plane on it anyway. This is where the story takes a turn that, described plainly, sounds almost reckless. A partially completed dirt airstrip cut into frozen mountain ground, under intermittent enemy fire, was about to become the only way hundreds of desperately wounded men could be evacuated out of a battle that was still very much ongoing around it. The gamble worked. A C-47 transport made a trial landing on the unfinished strip, and once it proved the ground could actually support the weight, the airlift that followed became one of the defining logistical achievements of the entire campaign. Over roughly 6 days, more than 4,300 casualties were flown out of Hagaruri under the constant threat of enemy fire, an evacuation effort that, according to later Air Force accounts, made this the first time in history that a full division-sized element had been sustained and evacuated by air for this length of time under active combat conditions. Aircraft flying the route also brought desperately needed supplies and fresh troops in on the return trip, some of the only reinforcements to reach the surrounded division during the entire siege. Counting the full scope of the airlift across the entire length of the campaign, rather than just those 6 days at Hagaruri, the Air Force's own post-war history credits its transport squadrons with delivering roughly 1,600 tons of supplies and equipment to the encircled forces and evacuating close to 4,700 wounded troops in total, an effort made possible only by the combined work of Air Force loadmasters flying the missions, Army engineers who built and maintained the airstrips under fire, and Navy and Marine aviators who kept Chinese anti-aircraft positions suppressed well enough for the transports to operate at all. Some historians studying the campaign afterward have pointed to exactly this kind of integration: Army engineers, Air Force transports, Navy and Marine air power, and Marine infantry, all functioning as a single coordinated effort under nearly impossible conditions, as an early unplanned proving ground for what would later become formal Marine Corps doctrine, built around combining air and ground forces into a single unified task force. Nobody at Hagaruri in early December of 1950 was thinking about future doctrine while the fighting was still underway. They were simply trying to get their wounded out and keep their own weapons firing, using whatever combination of services and equipment happened to be available at the time. While Hagaruri's perimeter held and its impossible airstrip did its impossible work, a much smaller, far more isolated fight was unfolding at Toktong Pass, on the high ground overlooking the road between Udamni and Hagaruri. Fox Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, under Captain William Barber, had been posted there specifically to protect this critical stretch of the division's main supply route, climbing 7 miles of frozen terrain to occupy a low, rocky hill with clear fields of fire over a bend in the road below. Just before midnight on November 27th, Barber radioed his superiors to report that 234 Marines, 12 Navy corpsmen, and a single civilian interpreter were dug in, ready and effective. None of them yet knew that the ground they now occupied was already surrounded by roughly 10,000 Chinese soldiers. At 2 a.m, the company was woken by the sound of bugles, whistles, cymbals, and drum beats, the unmistakable signature of a full-scale Chinese night assault, thousands of infantry advancing on a position held by barely 200 men. What followed was 4 days and 5 nights of nearly continuous attacks. Early in the fighting, on the morning of the 29th, Barber himself was severely wounded, first taking a bullet to the groin that he stuffed with a handkerchief and continued fighting through, and later a second wound to the leg. He refused evacuation entirely, and refused a direct order over the radio to abandon the position and withdraw, arguing that his company had too many wounded to move safely, and that 2 full Marine regiments further north were themselves surrounded, and would need this exact pass held open to have any way out at all. Rather than withdraw, he requested an emergency airdrop of ammunition, medical supplies and radio batteries, and continued directing the defence from a stretcher, carried up and down the lines by his own men so he could keep personal control of the fighting, even as he was, by any reasonable measure, too badly wounded to still be commanding anyone. The cold shaped this fight as thoroughly as the Chinese did. Standard rifle lubricant thickened into something close to glue in the sub-zero temperatures, making the lighter M1 carbines carried by some Marines unreliable at exactly the wrong moments, while heavier weapons like the Browning automatic rifle and the company's machine guns held up somewhat better. Chinese forces, by contrast, had reportedly taken to using whale oil as a weapons lubricant, a substance that simply didn't gel the same way in extreme cold, giving them one of the few equipment advantages either side held during this entire campaign. Because rifles could not always be trusted to fire reliably, hand grenades became an unusually central part of the fighting at Fox Hill, used so heavily that Marines had to be given special field instructions on how to arm them properly in the cold to make sure they would actually detonate once thrown. Corpsmen treating the wounded kept morphine syrettes warming in their own mouths, and wrapped intravenous bottles in scarves to keep the fluid inside from freezing solid before it could reach a wounded man's veins. In at least one section of the perimeter, with the ground too frozen to dig deeper positions, Marines stacked the bodies of Chinese dead in place of sandbags and fired from behind them, some reportedly wearing scraps of resupply parachute silk as makeshift camouflage against the snow. By the time relief finally arrived, Fox Company had lost roughly 3/4 of its strength, killed, wounded, or captured. A relief force of some 500 Marines under Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Davis, who had himself received the Medal of Honor for the action, set out from Udumne not along the road itself, which remained blocked and contested, but directly across the frozen mountains, moving at night through waist-deep snow and temperatures that never rose above roughly 20 degrees below zero for the entire march. Davis's men, who came to be known informally as the Ridge Runners for the cross-country route they took, navigated largely by compass, bearing through terrain with no roads or trails at all, carrying their own wounded as they went and fighting through several small Chinese positions, blocking their path before finally reaching Fox Company's perimeter and helping clear the surviving Chinese troops still pressing the position, with Marine artillery and air support finishing the job once the attackers were flushed into the open. Of the roughly 220 Marines who had originally dug in on that hill, only 82 walked off it under their own power when the fighting was finally over. Barber spent months recovering in military hospitals afterward and was awarded the Medal of Honor in 1952, one of 3 eventually earned during the defense of Fox Hill alone. He remained in the Marine Corps and retired as a full colonel 2 decades later. That was only round 1 for Fox Company, because holding Tok'tong Pass for those 5 brutal days didn't just save the men on that particular hill. It kept the entire road between Udumne and Hagaruri open long enough for the Marines fighting further north to have any usable route south at all. Close air support played its own critical role throughout this stretch of the campaign, one that veterans who survived it still bring up decades later with something close to reverence. American Corsair fighters, flying in weather that grounded most other aircraft, provided strikes close enough to friendly positions to make an immediate difference in engagements that would otherwise have been decided purely by which side had more ammunition left. One Marine veteran, recalling his unit's own commanding officer decades afterward, credited that officer's prior experience with naval aircraft operations from the Second World War directly with saving lives during the campaign, since that experience translated into knowing exactly how to call in and coordinate airstrikes close enough to be genuinely useful without endangering the very men those strikes were meant to protect. Corsairs, in the recollection of more than one Chosin veteran, were the difference between holding a position and losing it, arriving low and fast over terrain. Chinese infantry had assumed no aircraft would risk flying through at all. But this wasn't just about Hagaruri and Tok'tong Pass anymore. While engineers finished their impossible airstrip and Fox Company held their impossible hill, east of the reservoir, Task Force Faith was fighting a battle of its own, one that history would take decades to properly credit, and one that, without it, historians now believe the entire Marine breakout might never have happened at all. 4 days before the Chinese attack began, Task Force McLean had been a fairly ordinary assignment on paper: relieve Marine positions east of the reservoir, screen the flank, wait for further orders from Corps. By December the 1st, what remained of that same task force, now under Lieutenant Colonel Don Faith following McLean's death in the fighting days earlier, was making a desperate attempt to break out of encirclement entirely on its own, with almost no outside support to draw on. Task Force Faith had taken enormous losses in the days since the Chinese attack began. Cut off from Hagaruri, facing repeated night assaults, and lacking the kind of stockpiled supplies and tight unit cohesion the Marines further west had built up over the preceding weeks of careful, methodical advance, the task force's situation had become genuinely critical. On December 1st, with hundreds of wounded men loaded onto the backs of every available truck, Faith gave the order to break out south, 5 miles down the road, toward the relative safety of the Marine perimeter at Hagaruri. The breakout did not go smoothly. Early in the attempt, a napalm strike meant to support the column landed too close to Faith's own men, wounding several of his own soldiers in the very attack meant to clear their path forward. According to accounts from officers present, Faith had to draw his own pistol more than once simply to keep panicked wounded men from climbing onto already overloaded trucks out of turn, threatening to tip the entire convoy into chaos. Despite the confusion, the column kept moving, fighting through repeated ambushes along the short but brutal stretch of road toward Hagaruri. The column was stopped again a short distance further south by a Chinese roadblock dug into the base of a hill numbered 1221 on American maps, close enough that some of the tanks and artillery already positioned at Hagaruri could have provided supporting fire, though for reasons that remain disputed among historians, that support never actually arrived in time to help. Two small groups of soldiers, led by officers who were themselves already wounded, stormed the hill directly despite the missing artillery support and cleared most of Chinese positions on it, at a severe cost in casualties. By the time the hill was taken, it was nearly dark and the lights of Hagaruri were visible in the distance across the frozen surface of the reservoir itself, close enough that some of the men who had just fought their way up that hill chose not to return to the slow-moving truck column at all, and instead struck out on foot directly across the ice toward the marine perimeter they could see glowing in the darkness ahead of them. Faith got what remained of the convoy moving again, only to run into yet another roadblock just north of Hudong, close enough to marine lines that it marked the effective end of the column as an organised fighting force. Chinese troops brought heavy fire directly onto the stalled trucks, lobbing grenades and firing rifles into vehicles packed with wounded men who had no way to fight back or escape. Lieutenant Colonel Don Faith did not survive that breakout. He was killed leading his men through the fighting, and with his death, what remained of the column's command and cohesion broke down entirely. Those who still could scrambled clear of the trucks and struck out on foot across the frozen surface of the reservoir itself, heading toward the lights of Hagaruri in the distance. Their rescue, when it came, arrived in an unlikely form. Lieutenant Colonel Olin Beale, commanding the Marines' own 1st Motor Transport Battalion at Hagaruri, organised a rescue effort by jeep driving out onto the ice himself to search for survivors stumbling in from the direction of the destroyed column. Over the following night, Beale and the men working with him pulled more than 300 survivors off the frozen reservoir, many of them wounded, frostbitten, or in outright shock from what they had just been through. In total, just over 1,000 men from what had been Task Force Faith eventually reached marine lines, and of those only around 385 were still considered able-bodied enough to fight. The survivors, along with other soldiers from the same shattered 7th Infantry Division, were folded into a single provisional battalion and attached directly to the 7th Marines for whatever came next, a scattered remnant of a task force that, 5 days earlier, had been sent forward to screen a flank that nobody at the time believed was in any serious danger at all. Here's the detail that took the United States Army nearly 50 years to fully credit. For a long time after the war, Task Force Faith's stand east of the reservoir was remembered. When it was remembered at all, mostly as a defeat, a badly coordinated unit that had simply been destroyed. Later, historical study, drawing on both American and Chinese sources gathered decades afterward, reached a very different conclusion. Task Force Faith had held off a significantly larger Chinese force than anyone realised at the time for 5 critical days, buying time that likely kept the entire 1st Marine Division from being overrun entirely. In September of 1999, the unit was finally awarded the Presidential Unit Citation for its actions at Chosin, an honour that had actually been proposed decades earlier, back in 1952, and blocked at the time by Major General Smith himself, which, looking back with everything historians now know, says something uncomfortable about how history gets written in the immediate aftermath of a battle, and how long it can sometimes take for that record to be corrected. While Task Force Faith fought its desperate battle east of the reservoir, the Marines at Udamni were fighting their own way south toward Hagaruri, a fight that would take days rather than hours to complete. On December the 1st, the same day, Faith's column began its own breakout. The 5th and 7th Marines began their movement south from Udamni, fighting through Chinese positions dug into the high ground on both sides of the road for the entire distance. It took roughly 2 days of continuous fighting to cover that stretch, with the column finally reaching the Hagaruri perimeter on December 3rd, exhausted almost beyond ordinary description. Marine veteran Martin Overholt, recalling that March years later, said simply that he remembered being so tired. There were times he actually fell asleep standing up, still walking, still moving south with the rest of the column around him. When the exhausted column finally reached the perimeter at Hagaruri on the afternoon of December 3rd, the men already gathered there watching them arrive found themselves witnessing something they hadn't expected. Watson Crumby, among those watching the column come in, remembered the sound most vividly, the crunch of exhausted men's boots against frozen ground, and someone nearby muttering almost reverently, "Look at those bastards, those magnificent bastards." Overholt, one of the men actually in that column, recalled that somebody started singing the Marine Corps hymn as they came through the line, and that he simply couldn't believe it. Exhausted men singing after what they had just survived. Someone handed him a canteen cup of hot coffee and a box of graham crackers, and he sat down in the snow and ate what he later called the best meal of his entire life. That night, sleeping in his own bag on a bed of straw inside an actual tent, felt to him like pure luxury. Clearing the way for that withdrawal fell, in part, to small anti-tank teams scattered along the route, whose job had almost nothing to do with tanks and everything to do with the Chinese bunkers dug into the high ground overlooking the road. One Marine, manning a roadblock between Hagaruri and Udamni with his own anti-tank unit, recalled the unsettling realization that had come days earlier, riding trucks up toward the reservoir and noticing freshly dug bunkers lining the hillsides on both sides of the road, evidence that the Chinese had already been there, waiting, long before anyone in his unit understood what those bunkers actually meant. In the days that followed, his unit spent hours crawling up frozen mountainsides carrying a 75mm recoilless rifle, a shoulder-mounted anti-tank weapon repurposed here for a completely different job, systematically destroying Chinese bunker positions one at a time to let the 5th and 7th Marines continue moving south and east out of the valley. Further south, another Marine sergeant found himself part of an effort to move roughly 4,000 men north from the reservoir's southeastern tip, specifically to help secure the route out for the 10,000 Marines and Army soldiers still trapped further north. His own provisional company, badly thinned by the fighting, numbered only about 30 men by that point, a fraction of the roughly 160 men it should have carried at full strength. By this point, some voices in the press, and even some officers back in Tokyo, had already begun describing what was happening at Chosin as a retreat, or worse, as an outright rout. Major General Smith rejected that framing directly, and did so publicly in front of the Time and Life correspondents who had gathered at Hagaruri once the Marine regiments began arriving back from Udamni. One soldier present, John Edward Gray, later recalled the exact exchange. A correspondent put it to Smith directly, saying it wasn't like Marines to retreat, and Smith answered without hesitation, "Retreat hell, we're just attacking in a different direction," before going on to describe the division's own plan to fight its way out, bringing every piece of equipment, every wounded man, and as many of the dead as it could manage, adding that if they could not get out that way, the division would never again function as a fighting unit at all. Travelling with the division through this stretch of the withdrawal was a Life magazine photographer named David Douglas Duncan, already a combat veteran of the Pacific War himself, who had rushed to Korea from an assignment in Tokyo the moment fighting broke out that June. Duncan pushed back hard, later in life, against the same words Smith had rejected in real time. Asked directly whether the Marines had retreated from Chosin, he answered that a retreat happens when you put a stronger enemy behind you and move away from it, and that in this case there had been more Chinese soldiers in front of the column than behind it the entire way south. They didn't retreat, he insisted. They fought their way out. The cold that was freezing rifle oil and blood plasma solid did the same thing to Duncan's camera film, which he later described as becoming so brittle in the extreme temperatures that it would simply snap like a dry pretzel if handled carelessly, forcing him to load and unload his camera, hidden inside his own jacket, just to keep the film workable long enough to shoot. What he brought back from those weeks became some of the most enduring images of the entire war, compiled into a 1951 book whose proceeds went directly to the widows and children of Marines who hadn't made it home, portraits less concerned with strategy or terrain than with the specific exhausted expression on a specific man's face after days of fighting and freezing in the same unbroken stretch of cold. Asked once by a wounded Marine what he would wish for if Duncan happened to be God, Duncan posed the same question back to him. The Marine looked up into the sky and said simply that he wanted tomorrow. Nothing more specific than that. Just one more day. American newspapers back home struggled in real time to make sense of what was actually happening in these mountains. Some outlets continued defending MacArthur's strategy, even as the disaster around Chosin was still unfolding, framing the setback as a temporary political constraint rather than a fundamental misjudgment. One major West Coast newspaper ran a piece just days before the main Chinese assault, comparing the entire war to a football game, describing MacArthur as the coach who had driven his team down to the 20-yard line only to have Washington send in what the article dismissively called the second stringers. Just 2 days into the Chosin fighting itself, the same paper published another piece arguing that MacArthur's hands needed untying, framing the general as hamstrung by political restrictions from Washington, rather than acknowledging the scale of the Chinese force that had just surrounded 2 entire divisions in the mountains. It would take weeks and considerably more scrutiny from other outlets before public understanding of what had actually happened at Chosin caught up with the reality the men fighting there already understood firsthand. And that wasn't even the part that made people angry decades later, once the full story of what Task Force Faith had actually accomplished finally came to light. It was the fact that the men who bought that time with their own lives had to wait nearly 50 years for anyone above them in the chain of command to properly say so. By December the 6th, the combined force gathered at Hagaru-ri, Marines, Army soldiers, British Royal Marine Commandos, all of it, had roughly 70 miles of icy mountain road left between them and the coast at Hungnam. And one obstacle, still ahead of them at a narrow mountain gorge called Funchlin Pass, threatened to stop the entire breakout in its tracks before it ever had the chance to finish. Before reaching that final obstacle, though, the division still had to cover the 11 miles between Hagaru-ri and Koto-ri, a stretch that would demand nearly as much from these exhausted men as anything that had come before it. The division organised itself into a single massive column for the push, with the 7th Marines leading the way, the 5th Marines bringing up the rear, and a convoy of more than 1,000 vehicles carrying supplies, artillery, and the division's growing number of wounded strung out in between. The Chinese, badly mauled by more than a week of continuous fighting, but still capable of resistance, had re-established roadblocks and ambush positions along the route, and the column had to fight for nearly every mile of it. One stretch of that road, a narrow defile the Marines themselves came to call Hellfire Valley, produced some of the most vicious close-quarters fighting of the entire campaign. One Marine, recalling the fight decades later, described it simply as a big firefight that took his unit nearly 24 hours to fight through before finally linking back up with the rest of the division. By most veterans' recollection, the night of December the 7th, spent fighting through this same stretch of road, was the single coldest night of that entire brutal winter, cold enough that men later struggled to describe it in any terms that made sense to someone who hadn't been there. The road itself, by this point in the withdrawal, had become a kind of frozen museum of the battle's cost. Burnt-out vehicles, abandoned equipment, and the bodies of Chinese soldiers who had died trying to hold the road lined the route for mile after mile. In more than one location, Chinese soldiers who had frozen to death in their fighting positions, rifles still raised, were found still holding the exact posture they had died in, locked in place by the same cold that had been killing and maiming men on both sides of this battle since well before the first shots were ever fired. It's a detail that historians on both sides of the conflict have returned to repeatedly in the decades since. A grim, almost surreal image that speaks to just how completely the weather itself had become an equal combatant in this particular fight, sparing no one based on which uniform they happened to be wearing. Some of the men fighting through this stretch of road were, by this point, reduced to fighting with whatever they had left. One Marine corporal, having run out of ammunition entirely during a close-quarters engagement on one of the hills overlooking the road, found himself facing a Chinese soldier armed only with a combat knife. He grabbed the man's arm as the soldier lunged toward him, wrestled the knife free and used it to end the fight himself. Moments later, a second Chinese soldier came at him with a bayonet, and the corporal was forced to fight him off the same way. These weren't isolated, dramatic exceptions to how this stretch of the withdrawal went. They were fairly representative of just how close, desperate and personal the fighting along this final stretch of road had become by early December, after nearly 2 weeks of continuous combat had worn away almost everything except the men's own will to keep moving south. Despite it all, the column reached Koto-ri largely intact, having paid a heavy price for every mile behind them, and prepared to face the single largest remaining obstacle standing between the entire division and the sea. South of Koto-ri, the road out of the mountains narrowed sharply and dropped through that steep gorge, cliffs rising on one side, a drop of some 1,500 feet on the other. Chinese forces, recognizing exactly how critical this single stretch of road actually was, had already destroyed a small bridge crossing a key gap in the pass, and had repeatedly wrecked whatever temporary repairs American engineers managed to put in place afterward. By December 7th, The gap in that bridge stood at roughly 29 feet, far too wide to cross without proper bridging equipment the division simply did not have on hand at Kotori. Without a way across that gap, more than 14,000 Marines, soldiers, and British commandos would have had to abandon every vehicle, every tank, every single truck carrying wounded men, and attempt to scramble out through the mountains entirely on foot, in conditions that had already killed men simply from exposure alone. Major General Smith turned to his chief engineer, Lieutenant Colonel John Partridge, and Partridge proposed something that, as far as anyone involved could tell at the time, had never actually been attempted before in the entire history of warfare: airdropping the components of a full bridge directly to combat engineers still under fire in the field below. This is where the story takes a turn that sounds almost too improbable to be true, except that it happened, and it is documented in Air Force and Marine Corps records in exhaustive, verifiable detail. On the morning of December 7th, 8 Air Force Sifasnin flying boxcars appeared over Kotori, each one carrying a single section of an M2 treadway bridge, roughly 18 feet long and weighing close to 3,000 pounds apiece, rigged to massive 48-foot parachutes. One at a time, the sections dropped from the aircraft and floated down toward the mountain positions below. Not every section landed exactly where intended, and some were lost or damaged in the drop itself, but enough came down intact, along with additional wooden extension pieces, for Marine and Army combat engineers to actually attempt building a working bridge out of the recovered material, under fire in a battlefield gorge in conditions that had already frozen weapons solid and blood plasma into complete uselessness. Engineers, using captured Chinese prisoners to help move the heavy timbers into position, built a temporary support crib and laid the recovered bridge sections across the gap by hand. By the afternoon of December the 9th, the sections were connected securely enough for tanks to begin crossing, with plywood centre sections filling in the remaining gaps, so trucks and jeeps carrying the wounded could follow closely behind them. Vehicles began rolling across the makeshift span that same evening, an improvised piece of field engineering that, by any reasonable measure, shouldn't have worked at all, built from equipment nobody had ever previously tried dropping into a live battlefield before that morning. Roughly 3,000 pounds of steel bridge, dropped by parachute directly into an active war zone, assembled by exhausted men in weather that had already frozen Morphine solid in under 2 full days. That's the kind of number that makes military historians shake their heads even now, decades after the fact. With the bridge finally in place, the long column of vehicles and men began its final push south through the pass toward Chinhungni, and, beyond that, the port city of Hungnam. Chinese forces, themselves badly depleted by weeks of continuous fighting, and the same brutal cold working against everyone in these mountains, made scattered attempts to slow the column with ambushes along the remaining stretch of road, but by this point in the campaign, entire Chinese divisions that had once numbered 10,000 men apiece had been reduced, by combat and by cold in equal measure, to only a few hundred effective soldiers each. The last United Nations forces cleared Funchlin Pass by December 11th. On December 8th, before the final breakout through the pass, roughly 117 Marines, soldiers, and British commandos who had died in the fighting were buried together in a single mass grave at Kotori, the ground too frozen for anything else to be possible. It's a detail that sits uneasily alongside everything the survivors were about to accomplish in the days that followed, a quiet reminder of exactly what the cold and the fighting had already cost before the hardest part of the march had even properly begun. By December 11th, the last of the division reached Chinhungni and continued on toward the coast. The march south from Hagaruri to Hungnam had covered nearly 70 miles through some of the most hostile terrain and weather conditions American forces had ever fought through, completed in roughly 2 weeks of continuous combat and near constant movement. At Hungnam, the evacuation that followed became, in its own right, one of the largest sea lift operations of the entire war. Roughly 105,000 troops, 98,000 Korean civilian refugees, 17,500 vehicles, and some 350,000 tons of supplies were loaded aboard nearly 200 ships and carried south to safety. As a final act before withdrawing entirely, American demolition teams destroyed the port facilities at Hungnam themselves, denying their further use to the Chinese and North Korean forces that would soon reoccupy the area behind them. The civilian side of that evacuation had grown almost as urgent as the military one by the second week of December. Close to 100,000 North Korean civilians had gathered at the docks at Hungnam, desperate for any way south ahead of the advancing Chinese and North Korean forces, many of them having walked for days through the same brutal cold that had already crippled so many American and Chinese soldiers in the mountains above them. Landing ships originally designed to carry 200 to 400 troops, and their vehicles were instead loaded with 2,000 to 4,000 refugees apiece. Crammed into vehicle holds and stacked across open decks, every safety standard and loading regulation set aside in favour of getting as many people out as the ships could physically hold. Naval commanders overseeing the operation faced the same basic calculation again and again in those final days. Follow standard procedure and leave desperate civilians behind on a dock about to fall to an advancing army, or exceed every safety limit on the books and take as many souls aboard as the ship could carry. Nearly without exception, they chose the latter. One ship in particular, among the roughly 200 that took part in that evacuation, became something close to legendary in its own right. The SS Meredith Victory was an ordinary merchant marine cargo freighter, built during the Second World War to carry supplies rather than people, designed to accommodate a crew of around 47 and, at most, 12 passengers. On December 22nd, with tens of thousands of Korean civilian refugees still gathered desperately at the docks at Hungnam, hoping for any way south ahead of the advancing Chinese and North Korean forces, the ship's captain, Leonard LaRue, made a decision entirely on his own authority. He ordered nearly all of the ship's remaining military cargo offloaded to make room, and then loaded refugees instead, using cargo booms and makeshift elevators to fill all 5 of the ship's cargo holds and cover its entire main deck. By the time the Meredith Victory finally departed Hungnam on the morning of December 23rd, bound for the port of Busan more than 450 nautical miles to the south, more than 14,000 Korean civilians were packed aboard a vessel that had never been designed to carry more than a small fraction of that number. There was no military escort. The only weapon aboard the entire ship was a single pistol, carried by Captain LaRue himself. For nearly 3 days, most of the refugees on board had no choice but to remain standing, shoulder to shoulder, in freezing conditions, with almost no food or water to go around. Despite all of it, not a single passenger died during the crossing. 5 babies were born on board instead, delivered by a first mate whose only medical training was basic first aid, each one given an improvised nickname by the crew, since nobody aboard spoke Korean well enough to record their actual names at the time. The voyage of the Meredith Victory remains to this day recognized by Guinness World Records as the largest evacuation from land ever carried out by a single ship, and the United States Department of Transportation has called it, without much exaggeration, one of the greatest rescue operations in human history. Historians studying the evacuation decades later have estimated that as many as 1 million descendants of the roughly 100,000 refugees evacuated from Hungnam that December are alive today, scattered across South Korea, the United States and elsewhere in the world, their entire existence traceable directly back to a handful of desperate December days, and the captains and crews who chose to exceed every safety regulation they were operating under, rather than leave people behind on a doomed dock. By the time the last ships cleared Hungnam harbour, the full cost of the Chosin Reservoir campaign had become clear. Official tallies put United Nations battle casualties at roughly 10,500, split between Marines, Army soldiers, South Korean troops attached to American units, and British Royal Marines. The 1st Marine Division alone reported more than 7,000 additional non-battle casualties from the cold, bringing total losses for the division to nearly 18,000 men. On the other side of that same fighting, Chinese losses were, by most estimates, considerably higher still. Official Chinese sources later put combat and cold weather casualties for the Chinese 9th Army Group at more than 50,000 men, well over a third of its total strength, with some outside historians estimating the true figure even higher than that. The Chinese force that had encircled the Americans at Chosin was, by the time the battle finally ended, effectively destroyed as a fighting formation, kept out of combat entirely for months afterward. Historian Hampton Sides, who has written extensively about the campaign, put it plainly in one interview decades later. "All battles are terrible," he said, "but this one might well have been the very worst in American history, fought in some of the harshest winter conditions American forces have ever endured. It's a judgment that both sides of the conflict, in their own way, have come to agree with, even if they disagree sharply about who actually won. American accounts have generally framed Chosin as a hard-fought, costly success, a division that broke out of encirclement largely intact and inflicted serious losses on a much larger enemy force in the process. Official Chinese military histories, by contrast, describe the same battle as a victory in its own right, arguing that the 9th Army Group successfully protected the eastern flank of the broader Chinese intervention in Korea, despite its own catastrophic losses, while driving a technologically superior opponent out of North Korean territory entirely. Both readings of the battle can be true at the same time, and that in its own way is part of what makes Chosin such a strange, singular chapter of the entire war. And the timing of what happened next, on both sides of that same battlefield, was almost too perfectly ironic to write as fiction. The Chinese, despite their staggering losses, came away from Chosin convinced they had proven they could defeat American forces outright, a belief that would push them into further offensives in the months ahead, offensives that would ultimately be turned back with heavy losses of their own. The Americans, despite losing the entire territorial gain of MacArthur's advance toward the Yalu, came away from the same battle with something almost as valuable in the long run: proof that even badly outnumbered, fully encircled, and fighting one of the harshest winters any army has ever faced in the field, American units could still fight their way out intact as a cohesive, functioning force, rather than simply being destroyed where they stood. For actions during the battle, 14 Marines, 2 Army soldiers, and 1 Navy pilot were eventually awarded the Medal of Honor, the United States' highest decoration for valor, among them Captain William Barber, whose company held Toktong Pass for 5 impossible days, and posthumously Lieutenant Colonel Don Faith, whose task force's true contribution to the division's survival wouldn't be fully understood by military historians for nearly half a century. In the years that followed, the men who survived the encirclement at Chosin gave themselves a name that has outlasted almost every official designation ever attached to the battle. They called themselves the Chosen Few, a nickname that speaks for itself. Not the survivors, not the veterans, simply the few who made it out of that particular mountain, in that particular cold, against those particular odds. Veterans organizations built around that name have held reunions for decades since, an identity forged specifically in the worst 2.5 weeks of these men's entire lives, worn afterward as a badge of pride rather than trauma. In September of 2010, nearly 60 years after the battle, the Chosen Few dedicated a permanent monument at Camp Pendleton in California, a quiet, deliberate act of remembrance built by the veterans themselves rather than handed down by any official Marine Corps or Army decision, much like the small, unofficial fixes that had kept so many of them alive in the first place. The dead of that battle took far longer to come fully home. Under a program called Operation Glory, running from July to November of 1954, the remains of American and Chinese and North Korean dead from across the entire war were formally exchanged between the opposing sides. Roughly 4,100 American remains were returned in that exchange, traded for more than 13,000 North Korean and Chinese dead, a stark reflection of just how lopsided the casualty totals from battles like Chosin actually were, even years after the guns had gone quiet. Even decades after that, individual remains recovered from the old battlefield around the reservoir have continued trickling home in small numbers, identified through modern forensic techniques that didn't exist when these men actually died there. That pride came at a lasting physical cost for a great many of the men who survived. Decades after the battle, the Department of Veterans Affairs has documented that roughly 80% of Chosin survivors report chronic pain and numbness in their extremities that trace directly back to the frostbite and cold exposure they suffered in November and December of 1950, conditions that, for some, only worsened with age, turning old wartime injuries into new disabilities well into their 70s and 80s. Charlie Gebhardt, the Army sergeant whose voice appeared earlier in this story, carried his memories of Chosin proudly for the rest of his own life, saying more than once that he didn't especially care about medals or decorations. The only badge he said he truly respected was the Combat Infantry Badge, earned simply by having been there, in it, alongside the men beside him. The story of Task Force Faith in particular has continued to draw fresh historical attention well into the 21st century, long after most of the men who actually fought in it have died. A Washington Post feature published 50 years after the battle, titled simply "An Army Force Gets Its Due," helped push the Pentagon toward finally awarding the unit's Presidential Unit Citation in 1999. A quarter-century after that, historians were still working to fill in the full picture of what happened east of the reservoir, with a major new history of the task force published as recently as 2025, drawing on records and interviews that had taken decades to properly assemble. It's a reminder that even a battle as extensively documented as Chosin can still contain chapters that take most of a century to be told completely and fairly. Go back for a moment to that Marine on night watch in the last week of November, taking off his boot and finding his foot gone numb, with no idea yet what was coming in the 2.5 weeks ahead of him. He didn't know, in that particular moment, that the fix for his numb foot wasn't going to come from a supply depot or a general's order. It was going to come from the man in the foxhole next to him, swapping socks, tucking a spare pair under his own arm to keep it warm, passing that small, hard-won piece of knowledge on to whoever needed to hear it next. None of the fixes that kept these men alive through the Chosin Reservoir campaign came from a research laboratory or a quartermaster's manual. They came from soldiers noticing a problem the equipment hadn't solved, and finding their own way through it, one frozen boot, one thawed rifle, one warmed morphine siret at a time. The battle itself is remembered, correctly, as one of the most brutal fights in American military history. What's remembered less often is how much of the actual survival, the day-to-day, hour-to-hour staying alive long enough to keep fighting at all, came down to exactly that kind of quiet, unauthorized ingenuity passed from one exhausted man to the next. The war in Korea continued for another 2.5 years after Chosin. MacArthur's promise of victory by Christmas, made with total confidence only weeks earlier, was long forgotten by the time the fighting at the reservoir finally ended. The disaster at Chosin, and the parallel disaster unfolding at the same time along the Chongchon River to the west, marked the effective end of MacArthur's confident predictions about Chinese intentions, and the beginning of a much longer, increasingly public rift between the general and the president he answered to. MacArthur, in the weeks and months that followed, began pushing for a dramatically expanded war, requesting permission to bomb Chinese territory directly, to blockade the Chinese coast, and to bring nationalist Chinese forces from Taiwan into the fight against the mainland. President Harry Truman, determined to keep the conflict contained rather than risk a much larger war, refused every one of these requests, and the disagreement between the two men grew steadily more public over the following months. In March of 1951, MacArthur issued his own unauthorized ultimatum toward China and sent a letter to a Republican congressman openly criticizing the administration's strategy, a direct and public challenge to a sitting president's authority over his own military commander. On April 11, 1951, Truman relieved MacArthur of every one of his commands, informing the public that the general had proven himself unable to give his full support to the policies of the United States government in matters relating to his official duties. MacArthur returned home to a hero's welcome, ticker-tape parades, and a joint address to Congress remembered today, mostly for a single line about old soldiers fading away, even as the decision to remove him proved over time to be broadly vindicated by the very same events that had begun unravelling at the Chosin Reservoir 5 months earlier. What survived instead, carried home by the men who actually made it out of those mountains, was a name they chose for themselves rather than one handed down from above, and a standard for cold weather endurance that the United States military has measured itself against, in doctrine, in training, and in equipment design, for more than 70 years since. The shoe pack that froze solid around so many feet in November and December of 1950 was eventually replaced by an insulated design, developed directly in response to what happened at Chosin, that Marines and soldiers still call, half affectionately, the bunny boot. It is rated to withstand cold nearly 20 degrees more extreme than anything the men at Chosin actually faced, a piece of equipment that exists specifically because enough soldiers came home from those mountains with blackened, ruined feet that the people responsible for designing winter gear finally had no choice but to listen. Decades later, the Marine Corps built an entire standing partnership with Norway specifically around cold weather warfighting, sending units to train annually in Arctic conditions, developing doctrine, equipment, and instruction that traces its institutional memory directly back to the lessons learned the hard way in the mountains around a frozen reservoir in North Korea. That, in the end, is the quiet, unglamorous inheritance of the Chosin Reservoir campaign. Not just a battle remembered for its brutality, though it earned that reputation many times over. A battle remembered just as much for what it taught an entire military about the gap between what gets planned on paper in a warm office far from the front and what actually keeps a man alive when the temperature drops to 50 degrees below zero and the only help coming is from the soldier standing next to him. David Duncan, the photographer who carried his brittle, frozen film out of those mountains alongside the men he was documenting, spent the rest of a very long life photographing wars, revolutions, and eventually quieter and gentler subjects entirely, but he never fully set down what he had witnessed at Chosin. Decades later, asked to pick a favourite among the thousands of photographs he had taken over his career, he answered the way a man answers when there genuinely isn't one, comparing the question to asking someone to name their favourite finger. Each photograph, he said, was simply part of him, tied to a specific memory of a specific man, and most of the men in that particular set of photographs, the ones taken in the snow and the cold around that reservoir, never made it home to see themselves in print. That too is worth remembering alongside the frostbite statistics and the medal citations and the casualty counts. Behind every one of those numbers was a face, a name, and for however many days or weeks it lasted, a foxhole shared with the man beside him, trading a dry sock, a warmed ration, a spare weapon, or simply the will to make it through one more freezing night so that both of them might see morning.